Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Eclectic Reader. So I thought today would be a really cool idea to make a video talking about my favorite books of the past few years. So I've been keeping track of my favorite books and actually all the books that I've been reading since 2014. I'm going to start with 2014 and end with 2021. Now 2021 was not my best reading year. In fact, in general, it was a pretty poor reading year, but there was one book that really stood out. So in 2014, my favorite book was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. This book has now become one of my 3 favorite books of all time. Number 1 being Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and number 3 being Gullivers Travels by Jonathan Swift. Now, Moby Dick is told from the perspective of Ishmael. Ishmael is our narrator, and he is perhaps an unreliable narrator. I've read some commentary suggesting that he's not entirely reliable. Ishmael becomes a sailor on the Pequod, which embarks off the coast of Nantucket. Now, Nantucket at the time was under Quaker rule. The ship is owned by Quakers. This is really an interesting historical detail. And after finishing Moby Dick, I ended up reading a book about the Nantucket whaling industry by Nathaniel Philbrick. But the captain of the Pequod is Ahab. And like the biblical character Ahab, he is quite a despicable figure. Ahab is on a quest to destroy the white whale, Moby Dick. And not just because this is a whaling ship and he wants to catch a sperm whale, but because this particular albino whale took off his leg. Ishmael also meets a Polynesian man named Queequeg, and Ishmael's relationship with Queequeg is quite delightful. And one of the most righteous characters, one of the 3 mates on the ship, Starbuck. Now, Moby Dick is a book that people either love or hate. Obviously, I loved this book. It is a mix of different genres and themes. While Moby Dick is one story, there is a beginning, a middle, and an end. It alternates between chapters on whales and whaling, the cetology chapters, and then chapters that actually deal with the plot. I would argue that the cetology chapters are even better than the ones that deal with the plot, because while they are about whales, they are particularly about humanity and human nature. They're very metaphorical. Ishmael is also quite a nerd, so I loved him as a character. He, at one point, finds the skeleton of a sperm whale on the shore, and he gets so excited that he tattoos on his arm the dimensions of the whale. The character of Ishmael was inspired by another sailor on a whaling ship in the mid-18th century, Pillick Folger, whose whaling journal I've wanted to read for a long time. And if I do, I will definitely talk about it on this channel. This book deals also with the history of whaling and kind of get an insight into this very ugly industry. So Moby Dick was my favorite book of 2014, and the first read-along I ever participated in the book community. This was when I was blogging. So I cheated a bit when I selected my favorite book of 2015, which was Gullivers Travels by Jonathan Swift, because it was not my first time reading it. I've been reading this book since I was a child, and I read it every few years. But that was a year when I finally felt like I understood what this book was about. So the story is told by Lemuel Gulliver, and he visits 4 lands. Actually, he visits more than 4 lands, but he visits primarily 4 different lands. The first land is Lilliput. It's a land of very, very tiny people. They're only like a couple inches tall. And then after that, he visits the land of Brobdingnag, which is occupied by giants. So these characters are much bigger than he is. They're actual giants. In comparison to the Brobdingnagians, Gulliver is as small as a Lilliputian. Then he visits a flying island, Laputa. And then finally he visits a land occupied by very intelligent, rational horses known as the Winhams. It's supposed to be like Winhams, like you're supposed to like neigh like a horse. The way it's spelled is really wacky. And what I didn't realize upon the first 4 or 5 reads is that Gulliver is a very unreliable narrator, and I came to really appreciate that finally in 2015. This is, like I said, one of my 3 favorite books of all time. It is a book that deals in part with the British hatred for Ireland and its oppression of the Irish in the 17th century. It also deals with humanity and human nature. As you can see, I really love books that deal with human nature. But because I chose a book that was already a favorite that I just reread in 2015, I'm going to include another book, and that was my second favorite book of 2015, Murder in the Cathedral by T.S. Eliot. Now, that was the first time I read Murder in the Cathedral. It's the only time I've ever read it. This is a play in verse, which tells the story of Thomas Becket, who was assassinated in 1170. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry II. And at first, he was in the king's good graces, but then he went into exile because he sided with the Pope against the king in one of the perennial conflicts between king and Pope. And when he returns, there are these four mysterious tempters who remind him of when he was in the king's good graces and how much fame and wealth he had received while he was Lord Chancellor, but he is now thinking that maybe it would be best for him to become a martyr, because if he's a martyr, then he will be venerated by all. And indeed, Canterbury Cathedral was, throughout the Middle Ages, the site of the relics of Thomas Becket. It was the goal of this great pilgrimage that many people embarked upon, and is the subject of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is a very layered work, and the reason why I ended up as my second favorite book of 2015. My favorite book of 2016 was the first book on this list in French, Journal d'un curé de campagne, or The Diary of a Country Priest, by Georges Bernanos. The Diary of a Country Priest is told as a series of diary entries of an anonymous country priest living in the aftermath of the First World War. And he's this young, zealous priest. He's very pious, but he's also extremely naive, and he's constantly putting his foot in his mouth. And on top of that, he is having to deal with some wealthy parishioners who have lost their faith in the aftermath of the atrocities committed during the First World War and just the tragedy of the war. So this is partially a war novel, but it is mostly a book about faith and about leadership. What does it mean to be a religious leader? I should make a video sometime about my favorite works of Catholic fiction or fiction that deal with Catholic themes. If you like Gilead by Marilynne Robinson, you will definitely love The Diary of a Country Priest. It's a very quiet story. My favorite book of 2017 is a translated work, and I loved it just as much for the story itself as for the translation. And that's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, translated by Keith Harrison from Middle English. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight tells the story of Sir Gawain, who is a knight in King Arthur's court. And one day, a Green Knight comes into the court and challenges a knight to behead him. Gawain accepts the challenge, beheads the knight, and discovers that the knight doesn't die. Instead, the knight picks up his head and leaves the court on horseback. And now it is Gawain's turn to also accept the axe. And will he survive? That is the plot of this incredibly atmospheric poem. Keith Harrison's translation is just magnificent. He really maintains the alliteration that is in the original poem. If you love King Arthur, you have to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and particularly in this translation, read it out loud. This poem is supposed to be read out loud. That's what the translator says, and that's what I recommend to you. My favorite book of 2018 is another French work, Le Rouge et le Noir, or The Red and the Black, by Stendhal. So this is a work of 19th century literature, and it follows Julien Sorel, who's living in post-Restoration France. He is caught between two ideals, the ideal of the priesthood, which is the black, and the ideal of the warrior, the soldier, which is the red in the title. He wants to be a great man, and he knows that if he is a priest, or if he is a warrior like Napoleon, he will be a great man. But in post-Restoration France, Napoleon is no longer considered a great leader, and people who were in his service have fallen out of favor. And so instead, Julien, who is a very weak man in general, decides to court Madame de Renal, who is a married woman. And so this story is partially a romance and mostly a satire about post-Restoration France. I made an entire video talking about it on my other channel, which I will link below. My favorite book of 2019 was, yet again, you got it, another French work, Les Regres, or The Regrets, a sonnet collection by Joachim du Bellay. So Joachim du Bellay was a 16th century or Renaissance poet in France. He was one of the poets that belonged in the Pléiade. La Pléiade, or which is named after the Pleiades, were a group of 7 poets, the most famous being Du Bellay and Ronsard. These poets wanted to raise French poetry to the status of Greek and Latin poetry. They followed what is known as the theory of translatio imperii and translatio studii. So the translatio imperii, or the translation of empire, is this idea that empire transferred from Greece to Rome to France. Likewise, the translatio studii, or the translation of learning, is about the transfer of learning, the arts, the humanities, from Greece to Rome to France. So the Pléiade poets wanted France to be celebrated in the way that Greece and Rome were, and to make the French Empire into this worldwide empire in the way that the Greek and the Roman empires had been. Les Regres, as a sonnet collection, chronicles Du Bellay's experience leaving France to follow his uncle, who was Cardinal du Bellay, to Rome to serve as his secretary, and then returning to France and finding that he feels like France has lost itself, that French learning has disappeared, and he's angry. This poem is highly, again, satirical, and it also very much illustrates Du Bellay's desire to gain favor from the king, to gain his patronage. And he's also really jealous of his colleague Ronsard, who has become the king's favorite while he was absent. This is a great example of what in Renaissance scholarship we call self-fashioning, where an author creates themselves, fashions themselves through their own literature and their literary corpus. And my favorite book of 2020 was, yet again, another French work, but the last one on this list, L'amour la fantasia by Assia Djabar, which is translated as Fantasia, an Algerian Cavalcade. So this is partially a memoir of Assia Djabar, talking about how she grew up as an Algerian woman before the revolution. She's also ethnically a Berber, which is an ethnic minority in Algeria, so she's caught between 3 worlds. The title, Fantasia, refers to a musical fantasia. A musical fantasia is a mix of musical genres. Similarly, this novel is a mix of traditional prose and prose poetry. Assia Djabar herself is at the intersection of various languages and cultures. Also, she's a woman. She studied in France. She speaks both French and Arabic. This book also deals with 2 different historical events: the colonization of Algeria by the French in the 1840s, and then the liberation of the Algerians in the 1950s, so the Algerian Revolution. She focuses on the women's experiences. So if you are interested in post-colonial studies or intersectional feminism, I highly recommend this book. I will link an English translation below. And my favorite book of 2021 is actually the only one on this list that is a work of nonfiction. However, I suppose you could consider L'amour la fantasia as nonfiction, but yeah, this is the only piece of nonfiction on the list. But I do read a lot of nonfiction. It's just usually not my favorite book. It might be one of my top 5 or top 10 favorite books of a year, but not usually my favorite. But this year, or rather last year, it was my favorite book, and that's American Zoo by David Grazian. So David Grazian is a sociology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where I go. And he spent 4 years volunteering at 2 different zoos. And so this book is the culmination of his research at these zoos, learning about the sociology of the zoo. His graduate students had the best job. They basically had to interview zookeepers and various zoo staff. So this book deals with a lot of different topics, such as the intersection of the natural and artificial at zoos, how zoos kind of pretend to be this very natural space, but at the same time they are clearly artificial. These animals were selected, they were bred artificially, they are in enclosures, they get veterinary care when they're sick or when they're injured. This book also deals with the predominantly female workforce at the zoos, and it really gives voice to their experiences. And the fact that while zoos are run by women, at least the day-to-day life of zoos is run by women, the management is predominantly male, and so he does talk about that as well. So this is a fantastic book if you're interested in zoos and interested in some of the controversy surrounding zoos. It also deals with like conservation and the focus of conservation, what kind of topics are discussed at zoos, what topics are not discussed, and why. I definitely recommend this book, and it was by far my favorite book that I read in 2021. Please let me know what your favorite books were, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.